All right, welcome back to the Christian Economics series. I'm Zach Bartlett, and I'm a conservative Christian. This is my recording some of my takes on economics, including going over these from a biblical perspective. So this video is going over the questions about private ownership, privilege, how we ought to be handling this stuff. And I'll be saying up front here, explaining what the summary of all I'm saying here. My stance on this is I actually do believe that private ownership is okay, although there are some rules beyond what we have under capitalist law that we ought to be taking into consideration. Though, as I say that, some of you might be a bit confused of how I can be both against capitalism but still be fine with private ownership. So the thing I'm going to be clarifying up front is that even though private ownership is a distinct feature of capitalism, it is not the only feature of capitalism. Other features that typically get brought up are free market economics or also the competition. And though I think that private ownership has been used for evil under capitalism, private ownership is not something that is necessarily bad by default. And an analogy that I thought up here is with a bullet. Now imagine a bullet. You have two major components of it, where one component is the metal dome at the front. That is what hits the target. But you also have the gunpowder, which delivers the kinetic energy into the bullet. If you just have the metallic dome by itself without the gunpowder, that's not going to be very devastating. Likewise, if you only have the gunpowder, there's nothing substantial to deliver the energy into. It's only when you combine these two substances together in the shape and form of a bullet that you get that deadly piece of ammunition. And likewise, even though private ownership, as I said, has been used for evil, that is just a single ingredient in it. So now that I've said that, let's transition further. And I want to have some transparency here and to explain that I actually do consider myself privileged. You could keep that in mind as I talk about privilege and private ownership. In fact, my dad even owns a private business. And here I'm going to go deeper into that, explaining some of my experiences because I find it very relevant to the question at hand that I find. So, regarding my dad's business and my involvement there. First, let's start with the backstory that my dad, he has worked doing a lot of work in the plastics industry. He's designed a lot of plastic injection molds over the years. He also has experience with precision metalworking. He used to work at some other place in the county, although I will say his previous employer, he was actually effective at understanding how to run a business. That I can admire about the person. Although something that my dad has said about his former employer is also that he was, morally speaking, less adequate there. And my dad's experiences there have given him an idea of what not to do when running a business. He has attempted a challenging task of trying to run a business with a similar type of efficiency, but also maintaining some better moral practices while running that same efficiency. He started the business in the 2010s, and I, a number of years later, in 2019, began working there full time. It's been almost 6 years, and in that time, my two brothers have come on board. We also have another coworker there. And my personal experience at the company has convinced me that even though there is problems under capitalism, though capitalism does not properly incentivize moral business, it doesn't completely eliminate the possibility of a form of ethical business operating under such a system. Also, while there, I have gained a deeper understanding of how businesses work with regards to finances. He has taught us how to look at the finances of a business beyond the employee's side, where as an employee you get paid X number of dollars per hour. For a company's income, is not determined by that same time-based model. You have fluctuations in your income depending on how much work is coming in the door and not, and how fast you're doing it. I hope that what I have to say here is found to be valuable insight for this economic subject. Some people in America have this idea that we should be moving away from this private ownership model, be that capitalism or otherwise, go for in some case, a collective ownership of the means of production. And I'm going to now go over some biblical passages that are relevant to the subject. I'm actually going to be starting with some passages that one might use to argue for the antithesis of my position here, and then I'm going to explain about why I disagree with the argumentation. So, starting with an argumentation that one might get based off the readings from Luke 18. In Luke 18, you will find record of a rich ruler, asking Jesus about what he should do to get into the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus, understanding the position of this man, was aware about what should change with the man so that he would be heart set on what does not perish. And Jesus commanded this rich ruler to actually give up his possessions, distribute them to the poor, so that the man would have riches in heaven. But alas, the man went away sad because of his attachment to his worldly possessions. And Jesus then remarked that the people who are rich in this present world are going to have this immense difficulty in giving up their emotional attachment. So why do I believe that this passage does not argue in all cases against wealth ownership? I believe that is the case because if you keep on reading, you will find that Jesus transitions to the well-known statement of God's omnipotence, that with man these things are impossible, but with God all things are possible. In fact, if you look over in 1 Corinthians 12:3, reading, "Therefore I make known to you that no one speaking by the Spirit of God says Jesus is accursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit." So, whether or not a person is rich or not, as in, even if the person is poor, they are still relying on God to enable them to accept the Messiah. And by the way, looking back at Luke 18, I have noted that Jesus did mention that if the rich ruler had given up his possessions in this world, he would have wealth in heaven. So, overall, I believe that this passage of Luke 18 does not say we all need to completely drain our bank accounts and other tangible assets. Another passage that gets brought up with the subject of wealth ownership is in Acts 4, where it talks about the early church followers having this distributive function of how they share their property with one another. It's a bizarre one, very unlike what you would see in capitalist America. But one thing that gets mentioned about with methods of interpreting the Bible is to understand about when something is prescriptive versus descriptive. That just because the Bible mentions an event, like, say, the fall where Adam and Eve sinned by eating that fruit, that doesn't mean that the Bible is condoning that action. It's just giving a historical record. And that could arguably be something similar here in Acts 4. Now, even if that is specifically something that God at that time in history have wanted his people to do, then yeah, that's they would be following God. They're obligated to do that. But to say that then extends to the full scope of 6,000 years of human history, I do not think that is necessarily true. God has different plans for different people. And I hope that what I just said there about God having plans for different people, I hope that doesn't sound like some prosperity gospel thing. And in fact, the next passage I'm going to go over is one. Okay, now I'm going to go over a passage that I think argues for that we are able to have wealth ownership. private ownership of the means of production. I am actually referring here to words in 1 Timothy 6. I actually referred to this same chapter in a previous video when I was criticizing the profit motive of capitalism. But if we are going to be appropriately interpreting the Bible, then we shouldn't be just simply ignoring the other verses that might be contradictory to our previous positions. 1 Timothy 6, starting at verse 17, command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty or to set their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Command them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. Now compare this to what the prosperity gospel would say. God gives us wealth not just for our own shallow enjoyment, but also to enable us to help others. Even though it's a material possession, that material possession can be used to edify spiritually other people around us. Now, does that mean that we have to give up our wealth fully? In what I just read, I did not notice specifically it saying that. Even there's a way to use your wealth generously, even if you are still the one technically in ownership of that wealth. But I don't even need to convince you of that, because earlier in the chapter, you notice this command as you're reading that with this servant master relationship, that servants are to respect their masters. And if that master and the servant are both believers in Christ, then the servant should, I quote in verse 2, must serve them all the more. And I was thinking, if God really did have this commandment throughout all the millennia that we shouldn't have private ownership, I really don't think that is how that passage would have been worded. So there's the passages I'm going to bring up for now with regards to the private ownership debate. I will be getting to later some of my criticisms against the capitalist thinking, but before that, I do have some things I want to say in defense of the capitalist thinking. One of them is regarding this owner versus worker class mentality. I have heard the idea once that we shouldn't be looking at classes in regards to how rich a person is, so like lower class, middle class, upper class. That we should instead be thinking about this in regards to who owns the means of production. So really, perhaps just two classes, worker class and owner class. And to my understanding, the theory behind that thinking is that the owner class has the leverage, the power to control those economic circumstances. But with my thinking on money, I think that really what's the bigger factor of power is who has more money, even if that money is tied up in, say, equipment, maybe a lathe or a farm. How about I put it this way? I thought of the thought experiment. Say you have a small business owner that, even though they're making a profit, their overall net worth on the business front, maybe the business is only worth $50,000. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but technically you do not need that much money to be on paper considered as part of that owner class. So maybe this hypothetical business owner only has 50,000 in business assets plus another 100,000 in personal assets. And then another person has maybe $200,000 a year in profits that they are making. Maybe they have a nice rich job at working at some pristine workplace. They have a niche skill set that they can really make a lot of money on. That sort of person with a lucrative income as an employee would still have more net profit in 1 year than that small business owner. Or put another way, I had imagined that, say I wanted to start a manufacturing business, If someone offered me two options between one, a factory, giving me a factory for free, and the factory is worth $5 million, or give me $7 million in cars, let's say. So technically, the cars are not means of production. So if I took the cars, I would not be part of that owner class. But if I took the factory, I would be part of the owner class. But here's what I would do in that hypothetical offer. I would take the $7 million worth of cars. I would sell the cars and then buy a factory for $5 million. So I'd still have the factory, and then I pocket the extra $2 million. So this sort of thinking is why I don't think that we should be looking at classes as worker class versus owner class, because those are just too those terms are just too ambiguous to showcase the true capability of a person under capitalism. Another thing I want to defend the capitalists on is with this theory of surplus value. I have heard of the case of that the employee gets paid a particular salary, but the value that they make for the company is worth more than what the employee is getting paid for. And I understand the theory here, and I could see this being the case in some circumstances, but I also think that the way that the non capitalists typically talk about it is an oversimplification of it, because not once do I recall one of these non capitalists mentioning about the other expenses that go into the business. It's not just about the employee's salary. You also have the question of, well, if I take my own job, for example, the business expenses, aside from employee salaries, are CAD software on the computers themselves, renting the space out at the company. We actually do not own the building that we operate in. We also have expenses on paying for the machinery. These sorts of things, I I enjoy that I do not need to take care of these things financially because I am an employee. My employer takes care of this stuff for me. I think it's kind of cool that I get to go to work at a place that I do not rent using software that I do not pay for. It's not something that's a financial burden on me. My last item on this section of the list, it doesn't, I wouldn't say it fully defends the capitalists here, but I do want to talk just briefly about luxury, how we handle it. The question will get brought up sometimes, and I'll even talk about this later, about, well, if someone has luxury, why don't they just sell what they got, give the money they get to the poor? And actually, this is a question that the infamous person Judas Iscariot brought up in John 12, where there's some perfume, and then Judas asked this question on a, why not sell this perfume and then give the money gained from that and distribute it to the poor? Jesus had a valid response. I believe it's valid because he's Jesus, but also I thought myself of something else. That, okay, let's say you did sell the perfume. You need someone to sell it to. If everyone had this mentality of sell the perfume, you're not allowed to have this luxury, then there's no buyer. And so really, even if somebody did end up buying it and maybe having the same idea of like, yeah, I mean, I shouldn't have it permanently, but I can buy it and then sell it to someone else. Well, really, really, then it's just a perpetual sell, 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 and then really that perfume would just become, oh, another way to exchange money around. It really sounds silly when you realize that. But now I am in 21 minutes into this recording, and I haven't talked much about criticizing the capitalist thinking. So, what do I have in criticism of capitalism? So, I'm going to explain that, like I said earlier, I believe that I am privileged. I do not think that privilege is something to be ashamed of, but I do think it is something to be aware of. It was a few years ago, but I did see once about this something called the Opportunity Atlas, and it was showcasing how, depending on what area of the country that you live in, your projection of how wealthy you would be in adulthood, they were able to correlate that with the area, like even the zip code that you grew up in. And one can understand, like, if I take my own case, for example, I grew up in a really stable household. Both my parents are loving. I went to a school district that was better condition and didn't have as much student misbehavior. And as I have already said in this recording, that's my dad has a family business. I came on board, and even though that one of his philosophies is to not give us special treatment just because we are his sons, but it was still a huge networking asset. As the saying goes, it's not just what you know, it's who you know. And if you want to get a bit more experimental, there was an experiment done in the past with the board game Monopoly. And in this experiment, the experimenters, no exaggeration, they rigged the Monopoly game. One of the players for each of the games, they gave this special treatment where they had double the amount of money to start with, and every time they passed go, they collected $400, twice the standard $200. What the experimenters found is that, as you might expect, the person who the game was rigged in favor of typically was the victor. But what you might be surprised to hear is when that victor was asked about why they believe they won, they would give the answer of they believed that there was strategic thinking involved, as if downplaying the substantial impact that extra money injection would have on their performance. Capitalists say that they are for having the people who are effective at managing the resources to be in the authoritative positions like an employer. But under capitalism, with the sort of Darwinian happenings that go on where you don't make enough money, you go out of business, this would arguably mean that there can be many people out there in the capitalist economy where they are, even though technically not performing as well, it is not because of their merit, it is because of their lack of capital. The poor people who can are competing with the rich people who can. So there's what I'll be saying for now on why I think that privilege exists. But I said earlier that I think that there are some rules beyond what typical capitalism has for how the wealthy are to manage their wealth. Remember me earlier talking about the luxury spending versus charitable giving. I brought up my evaluation of you need someone to buy the pot of perfume. I brought up that argument not to justify all forms of luxury. I think luxury is okay in some circumstances, but I don't think in a lot of cases that you can apply this to. I think there are plenty of instances of luxurious buying that you cannot apply this argumentation to. If we are going to be calling ourselves conservative Christians, then we should also be understanding something that even non-Christians in America are recognizing. That spending $1 million on a private jet or a yacht or etc. does not go as far as, say, building houses or providing affordable healthcare or providing your employees with a decent wage. The former is luxury, the latter is helping people live. And I know what the capitalists sometimes say about, oh, that's the wealthy people's money, they have the right to spend it how they want. So I'm about to say something that might be the most controversial thing I say in this video, and I'm going to say it anyways. You do not get to spend your money however you want. Psalm 24:1, the earth is Yahweh's as well as its fullness, the world and those who dwell in it. We as mortal humans have a lesson to understand that we as part of the creation are under the creator, and for us, what it means for us to own something. We do not own those things as much as God does. So whether private businesses or the general public or the government owns the means of production, the aim should still be on serving God. And remember, Matthew 25:40, and the king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. A verse like that tells us, if you want to serve God, serve humanity. The Bible talks about charity, and something I want to also call out with the capitalism. I admire that even the capitalists, a lot of them, want to see positive changes large scale in the world. But when people discuss about how to undertake such massive projects, such as maybe repairing Ukraine after that war ends, or maybe reversing the economic devastation of Sri Lanka, etc., for large scale projects like these, you often hear the question of how to attract foreign investment. And one of the things of how investment works with this capitalist financial perspective, remember that when you have these foreign investors or domestic investors, those investors, yes, they are willing to give you money, but they are expecting a return on that investment, which gets even more complicated when you have a place unstable, like, say, I said Ukraine. If the Ukraine war ended today, then there would still be shakiness and the speculation. With that devastating war that's been happening over there for more than 3 years now, Ukraine would be considered a high risk area of investment. And as the theory goes, that the increase in risk will also mean that for it to be more attractive to investors, there ought to be a higher interest rate to compensate for the risk. So the irony I find with this investment to try to fix these big problems of the world is that at the same time that the instability causes that higher interest rate, so it's harder to pay off in that sense, the instability simultaneously makes the place less capable of generating that wealth to pay off the investment. It's kind of like what has been said about sin, that a sin makes a person dependent on a savior, but that same sin also holds back the very same person from accepting that savior. Investment is not charity. To properly do charity, we need to stop asking the question of what's in it for me. Consider James 1:27. Pure and undefiled religion before our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. One of my brothers quizzed me on why that verse specifies orphans and widows, and his explanation was that orphans and widows, they are the type of people that you imagine as helpless, as people who specifically are not in that position to pay you back. So the example of orphans and widows illustrates that sometimes we should be doing stuff for other people rather than ourselves. And finally, this has been a long video, but the last verse I'll leave you with in this video is Luke 12:48. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a beating will receive but a few. From everyone who has been given much, much will be required, and to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. I emphasize this verse to myself and to the other privileged people out there, that God gives to us, even if he gives us more, he will also expect of us more. He's not going to settle for less.